Hi there, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. We're going to let some folks join the webinar first. Looks like we're getting folks coming in. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. My name is Mallory Batchis, and I want to welcome you to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. And this webinar series presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, and it provides an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is intended to be a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, collaborate on the pressing and emerging issues that we're all facing right now. And let me know if you would like to hear about something or from someone that we could line up for future webinars. We're always looking for new interesting topics and speakers. Today's conversation is legacy cities. And I'm really glad to have joining us Dan Baisden, Katy Shackelford from the Lochmueller Group in St. Louis, and she's also a CNU-Midwest board member. Travis Sheridan, who is also coming to us from St. Louis. He's Chief Community Officer at Wexford Sciences and Technology. Jason Segedy is the Director of Planning and Development for the city of Akron, Ohio. And Dan Baisden, who's an urban planner from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Let's see. Sorry about that. Not getting my slides to share. There we go. Before we get started, I want to remind you to share your thoughts on the Park Bench. We have the website here on the screen. On the Park Bench feedback is really helpful to us. Like I said, lets us know new topics that we can talk about, new speakers, new voices for CNU audiences. And I wanted to bring up that our next webinar won't happen until the new year, January 12th, 2021. It'll be at noon Eastern, and I'm really excited about this topic. It's entitled Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Strategies for Urgent Challenges. This is an authors forum. It is going to feature June Williamson and Ellen Dunham-Jones, interviewed by David Dixon, talking about their new book. So be sure to tune in for that. Again, that's January 12th, 2021. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dan Baisden, who is going to introduce the panelists a little more and start to talk with you all about legacy cities. Dan?
Thank you so much, Mallory. Appreciate it, and really excited to be here with everybody today. And joining us today, and I'll just go in order of the photos here, but Katy Shackelford, who's on our CNU-Midwest board. She's with the Lochmueller Group, and she's in St. Louis. Katy and I just want to give a brief overview. Katy and I started following each other on Twitter a while ago, and we talked about legacy cities constantly. And so we had a chance to meet in Fort Wayne, I think a year ago or 2 years ago, and just instantly connected and wanted to talk more about how can we make these cities stronger and better for the people that currently live there. Katy then introduced me to Travis Sheridan with Wexford Science and Technology, also in St. Louis. And both Katy and Travis have been part of a small core group that's focused on building legacy cities through Legacy Labs, which is going to be an initiative of CNU-Midwest. And then finally, Jason is somebody I've probably followed on Twitter for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And he's truly an inspiration and has been a mentor in understanding the roles and situations of legacy cities. And he is the planning director at the city of Akron. So we're looking forward to having some smarter people in the room than I. So really excited to talk legacy cities here in just a few moments. I am going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. And full screen mode. So I want to give just a brief background of what legacy cities are. There's a lot of text on here, and there's not going to be a quiz at the end, so I don't expect you to remember all of this, but this is kind of a general definition that they're known as post-industrial and shrinking cities which have experienced population loss and economic stagnation or decline over time. So what we've seen with legacy cities is there's decades of decline, disinvestment, population and job loss. Severe urban stress manifests physically and socially through multiple different ways, such as deferred maintenance, lowered civic capacity, segregated neighborhoods, and jurisdictional fragmentation. This is kind of, I like to call this the chickenpox map of the Midwest, but it's kind of just a dot map of where some of our legacy cities are. It doesn't capture all of them, but I tried to do the best I could to get a quick overview from 30,000 feet. But as you can see, it really does impact some of our core Midwestern states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, also Western New York. Legacy cities have seen their peak population, and then now they're in decline from that peak population. And so this is just rough estimates, but you're looking at Johnstown is about 70%, East Liverpool, another small city, about 67%, Youngstown at 60%, Flint 50%, and Buffalo 45%. Alan Malik, who is a highly revered author on legacy cities, says about 15 to 20% of the entire United States population lives in legacy cities. And that's why it's really important to have this discussion. Population and economic contraction has emptied municipal coffers of much needed tax revenue, while federal assistance continues to decline. And that's by another relatively well-known researcher who's Hollander, and I just forgot his first name, but you can find out much of his work online. Another issue that we see with legacy cities is there's concentrated poverty. And this is just some statistics from 2019. Youngstown, we're looking at about 35% concentrated poverty, adults under the poverty rate. Cleveland at 33%. Children in poverty is another big issue, and Youngstown 57%, where Cleveland's 50%. But it's not all bad about legacy cities. Actually, there's a lot of positive that's happening, and that's why we have this discussion today. There's balance, opportunity, affordability, authenticity, resiliency, and proximity to nearby markets. So, there's times, and especially the urbanist community, as we see on social media, that we like to write some places off. And unfortunately, I think that's the case with some legacy cities. We see a lot of opportunity here, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. And why is this important to new urbanism? It goes right back to the charter. One of the points is we stand for the restoration of existing urban centers and towns within coherent metropolitan regions. So we need to take care of these communities. I put together just a short book list. So if anybody wants to research some more and read some books, this is not comprehensive by any means. We are part of a book club. Katy started earlier this summer, and we've read, I think, 2 or 3 of these so far. But probably the one that stands out the most, and I think is a must read for everybody, is Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown. It's definitely something you should add to your Christmas list if you haven't yet. And a couple of websites you may want to consider as you're looking to dig up some more on legacy cities. Notes from the Underground, which we're going to be hearing about from Jason here in just a moment. Also, the Corner Side Yard is a great blog. West South Bend, Belt Magazine does a lot of work, and then CNU-Midwest. We have made that our one of our missions and our focal points as a chapter is to really focus on legacy cities and how we can help support them over the next several decades. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jason with the City of Akron.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, and it's great to be here with all of you and with this esteemed group of panelists. I'll just give you a quick background on myself, and I just had a couple remarks to kick off the conversation that are going to be in the realm of housing and land use, and then I'll kick things over to Travis. But I've been the planning director for the City of Akron for the last 5 years, and prior to that, the bulk of my planning career has been spent in the MPO world. So I was the director of our metropolitan planning organization here in Akron for close to a decade. And I'm a lifelong resident, other than my 2-year stint in grad school in North Carolina, of the City of Akron. So for good or for bad, I've been a legacy city resident my whole life, basically. And I think it has been an important experience. I try to look at our planning here in Akron, not just as a planning director, but as a citizen. And a couple of the thoughts I was going to share this afternoon or morning, depending on what time zone you're in. One that I think is really relevant to today's conversation is what I call a more inclusive urbanism. So I think, as a lot of you know, a lot of the national policy discourse on cities, I would say not all of it, but much of it presupposes a level of affluence and community development capacity that just isn't present in a lot of legacy cities, or at least is not as present as it is in some of the quote unquote superstar cities. I think in some urbanist discussions, the assumption is generally more people, more capital, more jobs, more retail. But what I've thought about a lot is, what about when those things aren't true? Or maybe some of those things are true and others aren't. What I think is really interesting, unfortunate, but interesting today is, with a lot of the social and economic disruption from COVID, I think this is maybe more than just a legacy city conversation. Some of the contraction of the economy and disruption to our neighborhoods, the real questions about what's the future of office, what's the future of retail. I'm sure we could do a whole webinar on that. I won't even presume to be smart enough to know what the answers to those questions are. But I think it's fair to say a lot of urbanist thinking, especially the stuff that doesn't involve design. So I think a lot of the CNU work is pretty transferable. Good design is good design. Maybe you tweak it slightly depending on the context. But I think some of the issues that are raised, I would say, maybe somewhat, I would say, in ignorance in the non-judgmental sense of that word. Just a lot of people don't necessarily know a lot about legacy cities if they've spent a lot of time in some of the, superstar cities like San Francisco or DC. But some of the concerns there, whether that's stratospheric housing prices or displacement, or even, rail-based TOD and things like that. It's not that they're completely irrelevant, but I think some of the conversations are not as transferable. So one thing that I've always tried to put my point of view out there about is, when you have a weak real estate market, it does make some of the playbook that's often thrown out there something that at least needs to be adjusted, not necessarily discarded, but adjusted. Because I think it's fair to say a weak real estate market makes a lot of things in urban development harder. The comps aren't necessarily there. The return on investment is more difficult. As Dan said earlier, the legacy of displacement or marginalization of people could be greater in some of these legacy city areas. The dynamic between the suburbs and the city is often different. I look at a lot of demographic data. A city like Seattle, in many cases, outpaces its suburbs. Most legacy cities very much don't outpace their suburbs in terms of whether that's educational attainment or incomes and so forth. And just one other thing I wanted to touch on real quickly related to that was zoning. And so, I see a lot of discussion about, is zoning good or bad? And my answer to that is always, it depends. It's a tool. Is a hammer good or bad? It's great to pound a nail. It's not that great to fix a watch. So I think a lot of discussion about zoning, and this is more, I certainly wouldn't say this is CNU level discussion, but popular press, punditry discussion. I find as a practitioner, a lot of zoning discussions get a little bit theoretical. What I find a lot is planners get blamed a lot for bad zoning, and I won't completely absolve our profession of any blame in that area by any means. I think a lot of planners very much want to reform zoning codes. And one of the things that I think is a real world issue that people don't always think about is it's inherently a legislative and political process. So that's not to absolve, again, technicians or planners from doing what they can. But I mean, just a quick real world example, we're trying to push through a form-based overlay right now in the city of Akron, and it's been hung up in city council. If any of them are watching, they should pass this. But it's been hung up for about 2 months with concerns about we're eliminating all of the mandatory parking minimums. And we've actually done that in other neighborhoods in Akron before, but for whatever reason, this one is kind of hung up with concerns from council members about, is there going to be enough parking? So we've been trying to work through that and sharing materials, including from CNU, about how other cities have done this and lived to tell the tale and had great success. But I think it's just a reminder that, politics is real and legislative processes are real. And so, and a final thought on that, I think also with the citizenry that, what I find a lot of times is that a lot of Americans are very in favor of harsh government regulation of other people's property, not necessarily their own. And so I think, and this is what I really commend CNU for, and I'll leave with this thought, is I think one of the best ways we can educate the public on good design is to do it. And CNU's got a great legacy of doing that, because I think when people can experience what walkable mixed-use urbanism looks like, they generally really like it. And so that's another thing I think we can do to take it out of the realm of theory. But anyway, with that, I will kick things over to my compatriot Travis for his thoughts.
Let me unmute there. Thanks, Jason. I'm gonna quote you because you used one of my favorite statements, and so I'll get to that quote in a moment. I approach this from maybe a different perspective. I approach a lot of the discussion around legacy cities within the umbrella of talent, attracting, retaining, growing talent. The reason we think about population decline is that people are moving out of these legacy cities, and where are they going, and what does that mean? And I'm in St. Louis. I've lived in a number of either legacy cities or second tier cities. It's hard, I'm from California, so it's hard to refer to anything in California as being a legacy city because it's also young, but these flyover country part of California. And the argument about, or the concern about talent is very real. When I first moved to St. Louis in 2012, so I've been here almost 9 years now. Shortly after I moved here, the mayor at the time wrote an op-ed about what it would take to grow the population back to 500,000 people. And I thought that was a pretty weak op-ed. And I challenged him on it. Nothing like a new guy in town, especially a guy coming from California, to challenge the mayor on something. But I understood his premise. He wanted the population right now in St. Louis is just barely over 300,000. I suspect that when the 2020 census numbers come out, we will probably dip below 300,000 for the first time in a long time, which is terrible. And his premise was, look, if we get to 500,000 people, that grows the tax base. We could do a lot more things. We could address infrastructure. We could address schools. And my argument to him was, what if we can make the 310,000 people, what if we can improve their station in life, their quality in life, their earning potential to a point that it generates the tax base of what 500,000 people might generate, or 500,000 people might generate. Because if you put the infrastructure in place to create wealth within your city, guess what? People will move there, and then you become an importer of talent instead of an exporter of talent. That wasn't very popular, because the popular thing is attract a large business that's going to create 200 or 2,000 manufacturing jobs or retail jobs, and let's count that as a win. But the talent that I look at, and this is where I'm going to quote Jason, is how these legacy cities can really focus on attracting boomerangs back to their city. As Jason said, he grew up in Akron, spent most of his life in Akron, other than that stint in. Like, boomerangs have that statement in their life. Other than that stint in, they've lived in their legacy city or their hometown. I've run boomerang strategies in Fresno. We did a small pilot project in St. Louis, and there's some things that I really appreciate about boomerangs. One, they're generally between the ages of 28 and 42. When they boomerang back, they oftentimes will bring a transplant with them, meaning they will bring a spouse or a partner of equal education, earning potential, talent back with them. So it's a net positive on talent. They often are not burdened by the status quo because they've lived in cities like in Austin or a San Francisco or a Seattle, and they've said, hey, that bodega was really cool. We don't have one in St. Louis. Maybe I can try to help somebody start a bodega on this corner. And so they come with this this air of possibility instead of a burden by the status quo of things can't getting done. And they are the first to acknowledge that their city is not perfect, but they want to play an active role in helping improve it. They often get involved in politics or in activism movements or work for planning departments because they've seen things in other cities. That, other than a stint in, is a really important time, I think, in a person's life. You know, we think that the only way to protect legacy cities is to avoid people moving out. My belief is the way to protect legacy cities is to give people a reason to move back. What is that narrative that's going to give them, that's going to compel them to move back? And this is not a narrative around a slick branding campaign and everybody wants to be I Heart New York or Keep Austin Weird. Like everybody, you ask the civic leaders in St. Louis, it's currently STL made, and that's like, it's not a civic branding campaign. It's acknowledging the broken parts of your city and almost treating it like an RFP and saying, here's how we're broken, people. Come be a part of helping it get fixed. If it's infrastructure, if it's racial injustice, if it's a fractured arts community, whatever it is, the more explicit we are about our brokenness as legacy cities, and legacy cities are broken because they're old, right? Things break over time, they just do. So let's be much more explicit about that brokenness and use that as the way to attract people back. And so that'll be my approach to a lot of this conversation today, is really focusing on the talent and the authentic transparency of our brokenness in these legacy cities. And I'll hand it over to my friend Katy, who I also met on Twitter. So Dan, you and I have this the same Katy connection to Twitter. And I think we've seen each other maybe once or only once face to face, but we did do a pub quiz together. So we're kindred spirits. Katy, over to you.
Thanks, Travis. And I will say, anybody else wants to be my friend, just tweet me, because that's how I make all my friends. I apologize to everybody here. I do have a little bit of brain fog. I'm coming out of the COVID, so bear with me if I forget my words. It happens. My approach to legacy cities is a little different from Travis and Jason, although we have had lots of great discussion via Twitter about our different opinions, and we should have a separate session after this just to discuss hillbilly elegy and our strong feelings for and against it. But my approach is a little different than our other gentlemen here, and it comes from, you know, in addition to my career really focused on legacy cities, this has been my lived experience. Grew up as a coal miner's daughter in the Midwest, traveled throughout the Midwest because, you know, mining changed over time, but it is, you know, I've lived in Appalachia, I've lived in legacy cities, and I've lived elsewhere where I've seen the power of place. And I think that's really what I want to bring to the table today is place matters. And so I kind of started this discussion with, why do legacy cities matter? That was the prompt we were given. And legacy cities matter because places matter and because people matter. I started out my career as an architecture student, graduated in 2009. So I really like, you know, getting beat up by the economy. But a really important thing we learned in architecture is that buildings can't lie. Buildings are, they tell the story of history, and our cities tell that same story. And one of the things I think that makes people uncomfortable about legacy cities is that they are a mirror of our values and the way that we have chosen to live. And I see a lot of head nods on our panel here, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. They're uncomfortable because they are a reflection of ourselves and our values and the way that we are spending and disposing of land and people. So when I look at legacy cities, my real asset, my focus is on assets. You know, living in Appalachia, I did my graduate work in Blacksburg, and my professor, John Provo, who, if you follow him on Twitter, he always has lots of great things to say, but we really honed in on the difference between growth and development. Growth is not great. Development is different than growth, and you don't have to grow to develop. So we look at, you know, the things that made cities into what they were, you know, that peak point hasn't changed. These legacy cities still have all the assets that they came with in the beginning. They're logistics hubs, they're natural ports, they're places that growth happens because it's meant to be there. It's just a natural fit, but we have neglected them over time. And this winner take all approach has not been helpful for the Midwest or for our legacy cities. But one of the things I've found, the things that mattered, that made them cities that thrived, have not changed. And the ability to bring those things back in the future is really critical. I think that we are seeing as assets, as critical elements like access to opportunity becomes more mobile. The idea that the places that exist in the Midwest and throughout legacy cities, they're becoming more and more valuable. And we look at that as the climate changes, things that fresh water, available land, those are all uniquely Midwestern things that aren't going to go away. The access to, one of the things I've learned over my experience is that we grow great talent. We just don't give it a great place to thrive. And so one of the things that I'm seeing is more opportunity coming back to allow our residents to thrive in the places that they love is going to be critical for our future. So I don't want to go on any more diatribes or down any more rabbit holes. I think we've got some great discussion ahead of us. So, but I do think that, our overbuilt assets are our assets. They give us more opportunities than other places. We have the room to grow. We have the room to develop and do things right. And I think now is an opportunity to take advantage of that. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Mallory.
Thank you all so much. That was a great introduction. And I know that this group has in the past and will hopefully today get into some really good dialogue. Katy, you hit something that I want to sort of tee y'all up on, which right there at the end of your comments, which was about this idea of the built assets being assets, even if they're overbuilt assets, that they're assets. And it reminded me, I also went to architecture school, and I remember one of our professors talking about the most difficult design challenge is a blank page, because there's no bounds to start from. And legacy cities offer us this incredible, kit of parts to work from if you really love design, if you really love, reinvention and in lifting up what already exists. They're this great sort of palette to work from. And I would love to hear each of you come with such different perspectives on, sort of what you have, how you've incorporated that sort of opportunity into your work, and what you think some of the future challenges ahead for legacy cities are in terms of facing that opportunity that exists.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll kick it off. For me, these overbuilt assets and the ability to the blank page is really difficult, like you mentioned, but the ability to respond is important. And places also have history. Just because you tear down a building doesn't mean the history of what happened there goes away. And I think that's important, that the assets that we have acknowledge the history that we've been through, but they also respond to our new challenges. So some of the things that we've seen is just the idea that a road is more than just a road. It's an asset. It's a way to revitalize community. And so when we were in Peoria, a lot of what we looked at was, how do we use our overbuilt right-of-way to do more, to be more, and to have a bigger impact? So can the road also be a tool for improving walkability and bikeability? We made some inroads and pilot projects of just using it as a method of green infrastructure, kind of fixing the problems of our past by incorporating new technologies and making places not only more beautiful, but more livable, and then more sustainable, keeping pollutants and that sewer, that CSO problem that we were dealing with. So we looked for co-benefits. This is kind of like, if you watch a lot of kitchen or cooking shows, there shouldn't be any tool in your kitchen that only serves one purpose. However, we built our cities with a lot of one purpose tools. And now is the time that we can make those tools more. They can do more and be more. And I think this is a great opportunity moving into the 21st century of making these things smart, making these things sustainable, and doing more with them than they've been used for in the past.
I'll add to that. I think I just look out the window of where I live in St. Louis, and I think there needs to be a equal focus on stabilization, right? And this is stabilization of the built environment, and also stabilization of the fabric of neighborhoods, and the stabilization of the people that live within these communities. And it really takes the city leadership to understand that stabilization is a long-term investment, and it's not as cool and sexy, right? Like boarding up something and weatherproofing a building is not fun or sexy, but it maintains that building's ability to stay intact over winter means that the building next to it won't suffer any harm, or the property values will not decrease as much. So I think that there needs to be a culture of stabilization, of a pause, of trying to make that investment. And then also, as I said, looking at what does it mean to stabilize the community. This could come from, trying to Katy's point, improving the quality of life by repurposing some of the assets that are already existing, so that the surrounding community, and I would say again, for a lot of communities, especially under-resourced or underserved communities, stabilization is an investment that they recognize. When a city takes the time to mow the green spaces, that does get so that the kids can actually enjoy them. That adds to the overall quality of life.
And I would just add, I think the conversation about the legacy of buildings and urban form here is really great, because again, kind of going back to what I said in the lead-in, I think sometimes we have these very dichotomous urban discussions where it's either Manhattan or it's sprawl. And when I lived in my stint that Travis referred to was in Charlotte. So that was a great, I wouldn't trade that experience for the world, because, living in Northeast Ohio my whole life, I kind of got to see Sunbelt development, and there was a lot. Charlotte had to recommend it. I don't know if you can see that it's snowing behind me, but that's one thing that was great there. The weather was really good, but it really was an eye-opener for me of just how new a city like that can be, and how places in Akron I didn't really think were that old relatively were. So the house you can see behind me was built in 1945, which I don't really think of as that old of a house, but I think to a lot of Americans, that's a really old house. And I think a lot of the built form we have to work with, in contrast to maybe at least some of the Sun Belt, is, I would say for any given legacy city, the level of civic assets or urban form is probably greater than a similar sized Sun Belt city. And that's something that we have to work with. It's not East Coast urbanism necessarily, but it's not cul-de-sacs. My neighborhood here is mostly single family houses. There's a 8 or 9 story high rise 2 blocks away. There's retail that's a quarter mile away. And it's not super urban, but it's also not monolithic sprawl either. And I think a lot of cities, Detroit, Flint, Erie, Akron. I think St. Louis is very fortunate because it's a very old city for the Midwest and has a lot of great, granular urbanism. But I think most of our cities do have a lot to work with. And I think even in some cases, like in a Youngstown where so much has been demolished, which is really sad and unfortunate, but a lot of that legacy infrastructure and that street grid, it still remains. And so there is a lot to build on that I think people don't necessarily think of at first blush.
And to follow up on that, in my opinion, when you're talking about the built environment, it's neighborhoods we constructed, in the turn of the century, 1800s and the 1900s, where you didn't drive a car all the way across town. It really came down to how far could you walk within a couple of, an hour or a couple of hours. And so we have that fine grained urbanism in these legacy cities that can't be, it can be replicated, but typically is not today. And the other thing too is a lot of these legacy cities have social assets, social infrastructure that still exists. And that's really beneficial and something we need to do a better job at capitalizing on.
Yeah, I might just add to the social infrastructure. Your physical infrastructure can be used as a way to promote social infrastructure. And that's one of the things I hear most from people that I work with. There's nothing that, sorry, this is part of the brain fog, but one thing I will say is everybody should read Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown, because it's important. These social organizations, they play a role. And the fact that bringing people together, I think COVID has been a really great example of showing why our public infrastructure matters so much, because there's no other place for us to come together. The park system in St. Louis has been a godsend here during COVID. I cannot imagine what life is like in the suburbs when you don't have a place to come together. So.
Well, and that question about social infrastructure, or that topic about social infrastructure, sort of tees up to something a couple of folks have mentioned in the comments and in the chat about, you know, the delicate challenge that exists in legacy cities of, and Travis talked about this a little bit in terms of shrinking cities, but that, you know, the delicate balance between supporting the communities that are still in legacy cities while still trying to help elevate those cities, contribute to those cities, you know, help the communities to spur reinvestment, spur improvements that may need to be made, and yet not displace those people. And I'm thinking a little bit about, you know, coming at this as I work on the project for code reform at CNU. There have to be tools, or there have to be, you know, different things that folks listening to this webinar could contribute or could be working on or could help to help support that. And I wonder if any of you have found in your own work, you know, particular things you wish existed, design tools or mechanisms or policies or funding streams. You know, what is missing that could help these cities to continue to support the communities that are there while still improving the future aspect of those communities?
I can say we're working with the APA on a legacy cities policy guide right now, and that is the question we keep asking. And the first thing that I would love to see is just complete reformation of the funding mechanisms. The way that federal government and state governments fund projects right now, it encourages, I'm not going to say bad development, but it doesn't encourage good development as much. And I think that we need to challenge the way that we fund things and how we value projects. You know, just because you get, it's kind of that same thing that you see right now. You've got lines of people at trying to get food in Texas while the stock market hits its highest, you know. And I think one of the things that's important to notice about that is the way that we measure things matters. What we measure matters. And if we're measuring the wrong indicators and we're funding the wrong projects, then it has a ripple effect across the board. So I would say I would like to see funding reform, encourage good development, encourage quality development over just straight dollars and growth.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So the company I work for, Wexford Science and Technology, we are a real estate developer. We develop innovation districts. That's our niche. And you know, we're working on a project in Sacramento, California right now. And oftentimes there's a funding gap, and so there needs to be some type of public subsidy that comes into these projects. And as a city dweller and an urbanist, I start asking, you know, at what cost, right? Are these monies that aren't going into the schools and whatnot? And the city of Sacramento is doing something quite interesting with their, it's an EIFD, Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. It's like a TIF type of solution, where 20% of that increment is being allocated directly to the neighborhood. So it's you know, not to the developer, but to the neighborhood to look at affordable housing trust fund, or to look at rental assistance. You know, I think we need to look at some of our funding mechanisms in a way that not only benefits the developer, or not necessarily benefits the developer, allows the gap to close so the development can happen, but also puts that money, make sure that money stays in the community so the community really can benefit from it. The second piece of it is I think that we can't have development without looking at, or redevelopment without looking at the jobs associated with it and the surrounding community, and asking ourselves, are we developing in a way that the existing community can work at the places that we're building, right? We don't want to build things or quote unquote revitalize things that are only for a population that's not there yet, but it's a population that will move in. We actually want to build and create and develop so that the incumbents can either with modest upskilling or with the skills they already have, secure employment within these new developments. I think that's where it comes back to being a very conscientious and engaged developer, and the cities putting some clearer standards on what they expect from development and redevelopment.
I think it's a great question, and some of the questions that are related in the Q&A that I think have touched on this with issues like gentrification, or questions about who is this for, or I find and I'll use our city as an example. I mean, this city has lost a third of its population since 1960. So in legacy city terms, I suppose there are many cities that have lost more people, but it's a lot of people. And even in my, almost 50-year life, thinking about all the stores that were in our neighborhood, I live a mile from where I grew up, that have moved to the suburbs, the steady march of retail to the suburbs following wealth. And it's an important conversation, and it's a tough one, because I think it's another thing that it's easy to get in dichotomous thinking, like, are those new houses for other people, or are they for people that live in the city? When I think the reality is often all of the above. Some of it is attracting people who might choose to live in the suburbs otherwise. Some of it is retaining residents. Some of it is, like Travis mentioned earlier, people who might not live in the region at all. There's certainly, the legacy of planning and urban development in this country. We don't want to minimize at all concerns about inequity, but I always try to keep perspective that, new houses are built all around us all the time in the suburbs. And rarely is anyone coming to those meetings talking about segregation or disinvestment. And often, if anything happens in the city, and I would add, it's often people who don't live here. I was just at a 3-hour public hearing on Monday with new townhomes being built on the edge of Akron, where almost all the people speaking were from our neighboring suburb. And, they were questioning this development. And I mean, I was pretty outspoken. I said, look, I've lived here for almost 50 years. I've seen a third of the population leave. We're going to compete with the suburbs for development. And I think that's the other side of the coin, that it's another example of sometimes that the coastal, I'm using coastal as shorthand. It's not every single coastal city, but the coastal superstar city narrative, I think it's superimposed unabridged over into legacy cities. And, we don't want to forget about all of the people of color and lower income people that were displaced by all of the freeways that cut through our cities and the inequities that exist today. But at the same time, I mean, I often talk to people in lower income neighborhoods, and they want new retail. They want development. They don't want to have to take the bus 6 miles to go to Walmart to buy basic goods. And I think in the reality of a lot of legacy cities is so much wealth and retail has left. It's a true hardship that sometimes people in the core city actually have the longest times on a bus, for example, to get to jobs or retail that a lot of other people take for granted. So it's a tough issue, though.
And oh, go ahead.
I want to add something real quick, Dan, that this discussion we're having has reminded me of, but I think getting back to the core of, what are the kind of tools, what are the kit of parts that we need to solve these problems? One of the other things I'd really like to advocate for you guys right now is reform the RFP. We keep putting out RFPs for, we prescribe the solution to the problem we think we have, and then it's just one thing I would really challenge you out there is stop putting out RFPs, put out a challenge statement, let your consultants come with innovative solutions and think about the problem differently. don't try to prescribe what you think is already the solution to the problem that you have. Just define the problem and let's find new ways to solve it. I think, you know, we're stuck in an old way of doing things because it's comfortable and it's easy, but there are communities out there in reforming the RFP, and I would challenge you all to do that.
Let me just, Dan, you were saying, but in that reform the RFP, let's look at local expertise as well. I think all too often, no offense to the consulting groups that are out, Katie, I know you work for a consulting company. You get enough work, you're fine. No, but I think that all too often we think the answer is, it's the Wizard of Oz, right? The answer is going to be provided by somebody else instead of realizing the answer was within us all along, right? Let's look at some local expertise. It's also a great way of retaining and attracting talent. Again, putting a challenge out there and saying, come be a part of the solution, or if you're here, help with the solution.
Just to follow up on the original question here for me, one of the things that Katie and I have talked about for a little while is this idea of a network of legacy city practitioners. That's something that I think would be really beneficial, because we, you know, as much as our cities are facing different things and needs, legacy cities tend to all kind of fit a certain mold and an extent of, like, we have those core issues. So how are we talking to each other? How are we lifting each other up? How are we networking and using best practices and case studies from one another? But the other thing too is a mutual understanding from the urbanist world in general is that legacy cities are not Portland. I remember driving to Memphis for a place summit, and in my car, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do my presentation. I was driving at like 3 o'clock in the morning. I stop at a rest stop and I open up my phone, and there was an article from another group that said the Midwest is dead. And I literally changed my entire presentation for Play Summit. But that was this huge, and it still is to an extent. There's this idea that this is the way urbanism should be, without understanding the real issues that are happening in this part of the country where a quarter of our population lives.
Well, and to sort of feed off that, there's a question in the Q&A that I wanted to focus back to y'all. That, you know, I grew up in a small historic town outside of Chicago. My mom and dad grew up in small legacy cities in Indiana, Muncie and Marion. And you know, you all are each coming right now from larger legacy cities, but there are a lot of small industrial towns, former industrial towns, and what were larger cities that they themselves have shrunk down. And you know, Marion, Indiana is the perfect example of that, of these smaller towns that have the same problems that y'all are describing at a large scale, but they have a significantly smaller population. They have a significantly smaller set of resources to try and respond to. And the question was, you know, are there particular practices, particular low-hanging fruit that you would focus on for those smaller towns that, you know, maybe are under 50,000, maybe under 25,000, that still, you know, there's still place there to, you know, reference Katie's comments. There's still a sense of place there. There's still a community there that has some of this, you know, these resources. How do they work to better stabilize and better lift up what they have there in their smaller town?
I think that the solutions, having worked in these smaller cities, serving them as on the public side and also serving them as a consultant, I will say you do have fewer tools to work with, but the basic tools are the same, focusing on quality of life. At this point, I would say, I mean, the Main Street programs do a wonderful job if you're relying on tourism as an attraction piece. But you also, once these communities have access to broadband, quality of life becomes a really key attractor. That, you know, if you can work from anywhere, we all have found that we're all working from home. Obviously, no one's sitting at their office. If you look in this room, we used to use that as a strategy in Appalachia, which was, you know, living in the Shenandoah Valley is a gorgeous place. You can hike everywhere. You can do so many things. The only thing we didn't have was like great internet speed. And if we could solve that one problem, then people could come and enjoy the quality of life and not need access to Washington, D.C. or New York City. And that, I think we're seeing a lot of that play out through COVID. But yeah, broadband infrastructure, Indiana's done a really great job of investing in broadband, but there are other states that really need to step up and fill that gap, because rural internet is becoming not only, it's the digital divide is probably one of the biggest challenges we'll be facing in the next 5 years.
And as a former Main Street director myself, I would jump in and quickly say that the two of the biggest things I think you can do as a community, a small community, is focus on one core asset in your downtown. We all have that one building, that one spot that holds value for the community. Start with that. And the other thing is really look at how are you connecting your open spaces, your parks, your access to rivers or streams or pools or something like that. And that's just a great way to get people outdoors connected. It all comes down to getting people back on the sidewalk again and sparking those conversations and relationships.
Well, and that allows people to not just connected to the city, but connected to each other as well. And, one of the, again, going back to Katie's point about, COVID and how people's work lives have changed, or St. Louis and its beauty, its wonderful parks, the ability to still have a human connection helps a person feel grounded in their city. And so again, if it's a small city with not a lot of additional assets, the greatest asset you do have are the people that happen to be there. And what are the ways that you can help them feel more connected to each other?
And I would just echo everything everybody else said and just maybe add a little bit of a big picture perspective. I mean, I think about a city like East Liverpool, that Dan mentioned. And I just Googled it while you guys were talking. It went from 24,000 to less than 11,000 people. But it's also where Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania come together, and it sits right on the Ohio River. And I think the hard thing in the smaller legacy cities is it's too easy to succumb to either kind of, like to use an Indiana reference, the Music Man type philosophy of like the snake oil salesman comes and says, just do all these things and everything will be great, or fatalism, which in my experience of living in the Rust Belt is a much bigger danger, that a lot of people truly have given up hope and they hate where they live and they hate everything that's happened. And with a lot of justification. I mean, things, you go to East Liverpool and walk around and it is a tough town, but there are assets in places like that. And I was telling somebody the other day, the first long range plan I ever worked on was in 1997. And ironically, it was a 2020 regional transportation plan. And I can assure you, we didn't forecast any of this that's been happening this year. So I think it is important to keep in mind, we don't know what the future holds. If you project out far enough and just assume the future will be like the past, you're eventually going to be wrong. And I think I just echo my panelists that it's working on those small things that all of them mentioned, but not succumbing to despair and fatalism, because you don't know what the future holds.
And I just want to follow up real quick before Mallory, you jump back in, but I've had a few conversations with individuals who are the planning director, zoning director, building director, or building code person. They also serve on council and they're a high school football coach, because they have to make money to live and they're working in these small communities. And so when we have these ideas of we should add bike lanes, their first thought is when do I have time to even think about a bike lane? So having that network and having that ability to talk to other people who are in like-minded situations, I think is super, super beneficial.
Well, and that tees up another question that we had from the audience, and it made me think, Travis, of what you said in the beginning about, the importance of both attracting but also lifting up existing talent. And the question was about social organizations and the age divide. So many of these cities have a much older population that, Jason, like you're saying, they may not believe in their city anymore. They may have seen it decline and are having a hard time, really feeling encouraged to spark new and change and all of those sort of scary things that maybe haven't panned out in the past. And at the same time, there's a need in those in the social organizations and in the just investment in the city in general for younger populations to feel engaged and empowered to do so. And I wonder if y'all could speak to that age divide and ways you've seen that successfully overcome.
This is probably really callous of me, but whenever I interact with people, I always group them into 1 to 3 categories. They're either an advocate, they're apathetic, or they're an adversary. Like, that's just like everybody falls into one of those 3 categories, right? And I think people in cities are like that as well. They're either an advocate for the city, they're apathetic toward their city, or they're vocally or physically working against any progress in their city. And every city, regardless of size, has people in each of those categories. I am so lazy in that I try to identify the advocates as quickly as possible, even if it's a small number of them, and continue to empower them. Give them small things that they can do. Now, what happens, unfortunately, with a lot of young people who happen to be maybe advocates for their city is they are relegated to serving on junior boards of and friends of, and please be the social media manager for our organization, because you cannot financially contribute. You don't make money yet. You're so young, you couldn't be smart enough to have a leadership position. And that's just all BS. Like, I think we have to recognize that everybody has a sphere of influence, and that sphere of influence is what their leadership capacity is made up of. And if you can find young people who haven't necessarily been beaten down by the system or quote unquote reality, let's continue to fuel that fire. But I remember coming out of college, I think Jason, based on your statements, I think you and I are probably about the same age. Like, coming out of college as a Gen Xer, people expected us to be apathetic or to be overly ambitious and want to get in over our skis. And what I quickly realized is we attribute a lot of things to generational cohort uniqueness as opposed to phase of life and just adult development. Like, a baby boomer was, if you think of baby boomer, like, they were hippies. Like, they thought the world was great. They were all moving to San Francisco to experience free love. And then, like, reality of life might change their temperament toward life. So how do we foster and fuel that idealism that does exist, and not extinguish it by relegating young people to the young people things, like managing social media?
I would say, in my experience, I have been infiltrating older social groups. And I like to refer to them as my surrogate grandmothers. But I think that's one of the things that we have to do to get out of our comfort zones. I have challenged myself that if I am only hanging out with people my own age, then I am not doing my service. And so I am a member of the DAR, and I hope other people will join too, because there's lots to learn from the generations that came before you, but there's lots that they're interested in learning from you as well. And I think it's really important. And the other side of that coin is, part of the challenge of legacy cities is you have a huge opportunity to make a difference, but you also have to make a difference. If you're kind of like me, you feel compelled that you need to do something, and that you also must do something, and that you can, and there's all these pieces fighting around. So find the balance and recognize that there are people out there willing to help. You just need to start making the ask. And sometimes it's your passion that will inspire others to get involved. And I will say that my surrogate grandmas have done a wonderful job of helping me get connected in these new cities. I've moved 12 times in my life, and it's these social groups that are kind of longstanding old social groups, like my sorority or the DAR, that have been my connection to new places everywhere I go. So get involved.
And I don't really have anything to add other than to tell Travis that I appreciate him for acknowledging the existence of Generation X, and we're here and we're proud and we exist.
And I'm kind of on the cusp there of X and millennials. So, but no, I would say the big thing for me is pilot. And the reason I say that is last year we had the Regional Neighborhood Network Conference in Fort Wayne, and we painted a neighborhood mural on the back of a church building, and it was amazing. Just getting a muralist and a couple buckets of paint and have some free food out there, and block off squares. And we had, you know, a 98-year-old with her great-great-granddaughter who was 3 years old out at that same site. And so you can do really small things and make a huge impact in your community.
That's one of the things I like about smaller legacy cities is they're while they may not have the same resources, they also don't have the same level of red tape, and so they are ripe for tactical urbanism of you know, turning parking spaces into parks for a weekend, or painting a mural, assuming you have the owners, the true owner's permission. You know, doing these things that are where you see a very quick turnaround, and it's you know, maybe it's the Tom Sawyer idea of getting everybody to whitewash the fence, but it's getting the community to participate in something.
I'm just going to jump in before we have to go. Mallory said I could answer the questions in the Q&A box. One was related to gentrification. I will say, if you haven't read The Divided City by Alan Malik, he makes a really good case about gentrification. We have an abundance of land, and I know that gentrification is a concern, but the areas, if you look at in total where gentrification is happening in legacy cities, and then you know, where decline continues, we still have plenty of land and opportunity available to take advantage of. So I would say gentrification is a very, very localized issue, and it should be addressed with localized problem solving. However, as a whole, gentrification outside of Pittsburgh, I'm not seeing it in legacy cities as a huge challenge.
I wanted to give you all one last question, because I think, you know, there are the folks that commonly work in legacy cities, and then there are the folks that maybe don't have as much experience. And I suspect that as we look based on things like climate, based on things like population shifts, that legacy cities are going to continue to be a space that maybe audience members, CNU audience members, may be taking a closer look at in the years to come. And so I wanted to offer up for each of you, if there was one takeaway that you would love to impart on the outsider that's coming into your city to try and do design work or try to make a difference, what would that be? You don't all have to answer at once.
Leave us with a stumping question. That's a good one. I would say for me, the biggest thing is that we are not like all other cities. And so you need to understand that you can't replicate what you've done in other places here. And you have to think local, you have to get local people involved, and it has to be from the roots up.
And I think maybe to add to what Dan said, I think there's a unique, I mean, I'm going to probably speak for my own city more than any other, but I think it's fairly common in legacy cities. There's kind of a unique combination, I think, of a willingness to innovate because of all of the decline and all of the things that have happened in these cities that have kind of caused people to throw the playbook out. But there is also a very large climate of like what I would call small C conservatism, of people being very leery about bike lanes or removing parking minimums, for example, that I mentioned before. And so I think if you're coming in, it's kind of working with people, to use Travis's formulation, who are the advocates that can help you kind of navigate that landscape of finding maybe the low-hanging fruit that you can find innovation on, and then also identify the minefields or the things that are you're going to have to kind of lead the population to water a little bit more on. And I think it's kind of having that finesse to work on both of those levels at the same time.
Yeah, I guess my quick addition here is every place has a story. Learn the story and then figure out how to tell it through design. You have to listen to the people and the place.
Yeah, and I would say, especially if you're an outsider trying to come in, don't worry about trying to change people's minds. Think about whatever capacity you have, how you can apply that and help other people achieve their capacity. You know, a lot of cup filling going back and forth. Use your capacity to help other people. And to Dan's point earlier, this is where I think a network of practitioners can really be a resource for each other. A lot of the challenges that we face, we're not the first ones facing them, and other people have solved similar problems. I think it's the willingness to share best practices, and to my opening remarks, be transparent about our shortcomings.
That's really great, y'all. Thank you so much. I want to thank Katy, Dan, Jason, Travis for really wonderful comments, educating us about legacy cities, the challenges and the opportunities as well. And I want to thank the audience for being a part of this webinar today. As always, a recording of the session will be available on cnu.org within the next 24 hours. So check back if you'd like to listen again. And I want to remind everyone again about January 12th. We'll be coming back in the new year for the next On the Park Bench with June Williamson and Ellen Dunham-Jones, interviewed by David Dixon. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.
Cheers.